Calaroga Shark Media.
September 20th, 1870. Cannon fire echoed across the Eternal City as Italian troops blasted through the ancient walls of Rome at Porta Pia. After over 1,000 years as temporal rulers, the popes were about to lose their kingdom forever. The last sovereign of the Papal States watched from his window as the black, white and red flag of United Italy replaced the papal banner over the Castel Sant'Angelo. Pope Pius the Ninth had ruled as an absolute monarch over central Italy for 24 years, commanding armies, levying taxes, and governing millions of subjects. Now he was about to become what he would dramatically call the prisoner of the Vatican, confined to a few hundred acres, while the Italian state seized his ancient dominions. This was the climax of the Risorgimento, the movement to unite Italy under a single crown. For Italian patriots, it represented the triumphant completion of national unification. For Catholics worldwide, it was the theft of territories that rightfully belonged to the successor of St. Peter. This is White Smoke, Episode 36, The Last King. The confrontation between papal authority and Italian nationalism would create a wound that would fester for nearly 60 years, transforming the Pope from temporal ruler into spiritual exile and creating the modern papacy's complex relationship with political power. Today, we examine the final chapter of papal temporal authority, when the last Pope King lost his earthly kingdom and discovered that spiritual authority might be stronger when stripped of political complications. Giovanni Maria Mastai Ferretti had become Pope Pius the Ninth in 1846 with a reputation as a liberal reformer who might reconcile papal authority with modern political movements. His early years seemed to confirm these hopes as he granted amnesty to political prisoners, relaxed press censorship, and established a council of ministers that included laymen alongside clerics. Liberal Catholics across Europe hailed Pius as the Pope who would finally bridge the gap between Catholic teaching and modern democratic principles. Italian patriots hoped he might become the leader of a federation of Italian states that would expel Austrian influence while preserving papal temporal authority. Yet these liberal expectations fundamentally misunderstood both Pius's character and the theological constraints of his position. The man who became known as the Liberal Pope was actually a deeply conservative theologian who believed that any compromise with modern political principles would corrupt the purity of Catholic doctrine. The revolutions of 1848 shattered any possibility of reconciling papal authority with liberal nationalism. When Roman Republicans assassinated Pius's chief minister and demanded that he declare war against Catholic Austria, the Pope realized that Italian nationalism was incompatible with his spiritual responsibilities to Catholics of all nations. Pius's dramatic flight from Rome in November 1848, disguised as an ordinary priest and escaping under cover of darkness, marked the end of his liberal experiment. The Pope, who had been celebrated as the champion of Italian freedom, now sought refuge with the reactionary King of Naples, begging for foreign military intervention to restore his temporal authority. The Roman Republic proclaimed in 1849 represented everything that Pius had come to fear about modern political movements. Led by Giuseppe Mazzini and defended by Giuseppe Garibaldi, the Republic abolished papal temporal authority, confiscated church property, and proclaimed democratic principles that challenged traditional Catholic teaching about political authority. The French military intervention that restored Pius to temporal power in 1850 demonstrated the papacy's dependence on foreign protection for its survival. French bayonets had rescued papal authority, but at the cost of revealing its fundamental weakness when confronted by popular opposition. Pius's restoration transformed him from liberal reformer into reactionary defender of traditional authority. The Pope, who had begun his reign as a champion of progress, now became the most uncompromising opponent of modern political and intellectual developments. The Syllabus of Errors, published in 1864, represented Pius's systematic rejection of liberal political principles and modern intellectual trends. This catalogue of condemned propositions declared that the Pope could not and should not reconcile himself with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. The syllabus shocked liberal Catholics who had hoped for accommodation between church teaching and democratic principles. Propositions that seemed obviously true to modern minds, such as the separation of church and state or the principle of religious tolerance, were formally condemned as incompatible with Catholic doctrine. Yet Pius's rejection of modern principles was not mere reactionary obstinacy, but reflected his genuine conviction that Catholic truth was eternal and unchanging, regardless of contemporary political fashions. If modern civilization contradicted Catholic teaching, then modern civilization was wrong, not Catholic doctrine. The declaration of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1870 represented the theological culmination of Pius's reign. Just as Italian armies were preparing to seize Rome, the assembled bishops proclaimed that the Pope possessed supreme authority over the universal church and could not err when teaching on matters of faith and morals. This extraordinary assertion of papal authority came at the moment when papal temporal power was about to disappear forever. The Pope, who was losing his earthly kingdom, was simultaneously claiming unprecedented spiritual authority over Catholic consciences worldwide. The timing was not coincidental. Pius understood that the loss of temporal power required compensation through enhanced spiritual authority. If the Pope could no longer command armies or govern territories, he must at least possess absolute authority over Catholic doctrine and morals. The Italian capture of Rome on September 20, 1870, finally resolved the Roman question that had dominated European diplomacy for over 20 years. King Victor Emmanuel II's forces encountered only token resistance from papal troops, who had been ordered not to shed Italian blood unnecessarily. The ease of Italian victory revealed how completely papal temporal authority had depended on foreign protection rather than popular support. When French troops withdrew to fight the Prussians, papal rule collapsed within hours, demonstrating that it had been sustained by foreign bayonets rather than genuine loyalty from papal subjects. Pius the Ninth's response to the loss of Rome was characteristically dramatic and uncompromising. He declared himself the prisoner of the Vatican, refusing to recognize Italian sovereignty or to leave the Vatican palace. The Pope, who had ruled over millions of subjects, now confined himself to a few hundred acres, rather than legitimize what he considered the theft of papal territories. The Law of Guarantees, passed by the Italian Parliament in 1871, attempted to resolve the anomalous situation of having the head of a world religion confined within the capital of a secular state. The law guaranteed papal independence, provided financial compensation for lost territories, and recognized the Pope's sovereign rights within Vatican City. Pius rejected the Law of Guarantees entirely, refusing to accept any arrangement that implied Italian sovereignty over Rome. His intransigent position created a diplomatic crisis that would persist for nearly 60 years, as Catholic powers were forced to choose between maintaining relations with Italy and respecting papal claims. The Pope's self-imposed imprisonment in the Vatican became a powerful symbol for Catholics worldwide who opposed liberal and nationalist movements. Pius had transformed his political defeat into moral victory, claiming the role of persecuted innocent rather than deposed ruler. Yet the loss of temporal power also freed the papacy from political complications that had compromised its spiritual authority for centuries. The Pope, who could no longer favor particular nations or dynasties, could more credibly claim to represent universal Catholic interests rather than narrow political calculations. The financial independence provided by Peter's pence, voluntary contributions from Catholics worldwide, proved more reliable than the taxation of reluctant papal subjects. The international support that flowed to the imprisoned Pope demonstrated that spiritual authority could generate more sustainable resources than temporal coercion. Pius's extraordinary long reign of 31 years, the longest in papal history, allowed him to reshape Catholic consciousness in ways that would outlast the political circumstances of his era. The Pope who lost temporal power succeeded in centralizing spiritual authority to an unprecedented degree. The generation of Catholics who grew up during Pius's imprisonment learned to see the papacy as a purely spiritual institution persecuted by secular powers, rather than as another European dynasty pursuing political advantage. This transformation of papal image would prove crucial for the Church's adaptation to the modern world. The cult of papal personality that developed around the imprisoned Pius created new forms of Catholic devotion that bypassed traditional ecclesiastical hierarchies. Catholics worldwide felt personal connection to the suffering Pope that enhanced papal authority more effectively than any amount of temporal power could have achieved. Pius's death in 1878, after 8 years of self-imposed imprisonment, marked the end of an era in papal history. The last Pope King had died without ever leaving the Vatican, maintaining his protest against Italian unification until his final breath. Yet Pius's legacy extended far beyond his personal martyrdom to transform the fundamental nature of papal authority. The Pope who had lost temporal power had succeeded in creating a new model of spiritual leadership that would prove more enduring and influential than medieval papal monarchy. The prisoner of the Vatican had demonstrated that papal authority could survive and even flourish without territorial sovereignty. The spiritual empire that Pius bequeathed to his successors would prove more extensive and durable than any of the temporal kingdoms that previous popes had ruled. The irony of Pius the Ninth's reign was that his greatest political defeat became the foundation for his most lasting achievement. The Pope who lost his earthly kingdom discovered that spiritual authority was strongest when purified of political ambitions and temporal complications. The last king of the Papal States had involuntarily created the first truly modern pope, demonstrating that the successor of St. Peter could exercise global influence without governing a square mile of territory. The prisoner of the Vatican had shown the world that spiritual power could transcend political boundaries in ways that temporal authority never could. The transformation of the papacy from temporal monarchy to spiritual authority would define Catholic Christianity for the next century and beyond, proving that institutional defeat could become the foundation for unprecedented moral influence when guided by uncompromising conviction and sustained by international solidarity. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration, but still written and produced by real podcasters, Mark Francis and John McDermott.